Welcome to the Awesemo MLB Strategy Show. And anybody who's watching live, we appreciate you. Thank you for showing up early. The reason that the show is starting so early today is, well, number one, it's sponsored by Jock Market. That's not actually the reason. I'm just trying to shoehorning the sponsor into the show. But the real reason is because we have so much DFS content on the YouTube channel today. All the more reason you guys should be liking this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Because if you are playing a multitude of DFS sports, we have everything covered here. We have college football live before lock. There's MLB live before lock later today, MMA live before lock, and the NASCAR strategy show. So a little bit of everything covered. But first, Adam, how are you doing? And how many DFS sports are you going to be playing today?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Haven't decided yet what I'm playing. Probably will play both baseball slates and college football and MMA. But I don't know. Part of me wants to kind of just like chill and take a weekend off to try and break the downswing. But typically I'm pretty bad at that. So probably playing a lot today.
Yeah, that's so for me, I have friends coming over today to watch the MMA fights. Also, this is for DFS, I generally don't like the 9-fight card. So I was thinking I wasn't going to play, but then right before we started the show, I was reserving all my lineup. So there goes that out the window, because MMA is actually, I think, one of the most fun DFS sports there is, and it's something that's gotten me really into MMA. But also, like we said, we've got a lot of college football stuff coming up. NFL season is starting. And if you guys want to dip your toes into the college football waters, use the promo code TAILGATE. That'll get you $10 off your first week of Awesemo Plus college football. That is the promo code TAILGATE for $10 off. And college football, I don't know anything about it, but I've had some success using the tools on the site. Definitely the projections that Matt Kajeski puts up, those are great. So use that promo code TAILGATE, and that's a good way to dip your toes into college football waters. But let's talk about this baseball slate, and we're going to be talking about the main slate tonight, 8 games. And first off, just any kind of overarching views on the slate, Adam?
Not really much that stands out here. 8-game slate, I think, are typically pretty fun because it's not quite as hard to hit on whatever offense you need to have to win. Obviously, your chances are a little bit higher, but it's not such a small slate that everybody ends up in the same spot. So, kind of just at first glance, pitching seems kind of not great. You have a Coors Field game. Seems like it should be a pretty wide open tournament slate, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the top stack odds that we have over on the site, there's not really one team that really stands out as being in like a terrific leverage spot. We've got the Braves going a little bit overowned, which that's always concerning when it's where it's situations like, I have to fade a good offense or be lighter on a good offense in Coors Field. But there are some interesting pitching choices there. So let's get into the slate. And right away, we start with the Detroit Tigers against the Cincinnati Reds. Tyler Mahle's going to be on the mound for Cincinnati, Matt Boyd for Detroit. Now, starting with Mahle, he's had a lot of ups and downs throughout the season. However, for today, he is going to be massively popular. 10,200 on DraftKings, 52% projected ownership right now on DK. Over on FanDuel, project for 36.6% ownership. So right off the bat, how are you handling the chalkiest pitcher of the day?
So one thing to mention off the top, this is the one game that looks like it has significant weather concerns today too. So again, early in the day, I don't really care. Obviously we're going to talk about the game, but just keep an eye on this one as we get closer to lock. There's like all of this could change because this game gets rained out potentially. So assuming it does play, Tyler Mahle coming in at 10,200, pretty reasonable price tag here. The Tigers offense, I think, like, they're still not good, and there are still strikeouts here, but it has gotten a bit more dangerous. Like, you have Akil Baddoo, you have Eric Haas back in the lineup, you have Nico Goodrum back in the lineup. Suddenly, the lineup, not again, not that it's like great hitters top to bottom, but it's definitely gotten a lot deeper than it was earlier in the season, where it was kind of just like if you get through the top 4 guys, you just start piling up strikeouts. Now it's a little bit more difficult. This is still a tough park to pitch in as well, but Tyler Mahle has had a good season. And again, there's not a ton of good pitching to pay for today. He comes in with a 28.1% strikeout percentage, 3.73 xFIP, has had some home run issues, so that's a little bit concerning. Most of his power has been to right-handed hitters, but I think given the alternatives on the slate, he's still going to look pretty good as long as the weather cooperates.
Yeah, and by the way, the current weather situation that we have there is, where to go? I just have the tab up. As of right now, it's definitely a risk. It's not anything that if this was the situation heading into lock that I would totally write it off, but it's something where it looks like it's going to start raining in the later innings or potentially after the game starts. It's a situation where it does appear like it's going to rain there. But it's just if the weather gets moved up a little bit, then that game really becomes dicey. Right now, it looks like you said a little risky, but early in the day, and we've got, what do we have here? 10 hours until the slate lock. So a lot of time to really parse out the weather. And that's something that we always have going on updates in our Slack chat. El Negro Loco, the news god, he's always on top of that stuff. So always be on the lookout for any kind of weather updates. But on the other side of Tyler Mahle, considering all the ownership that he's getting, what does that make you think of the Tigers as a leverage stack?
I'm interested just because I think Tyler Mahle is a good pitcher, but I don't think he is like a true elite ace as far as someone that like you're really shocked if he has a rough game. And then you do also get a really, really good park to hit in. And like I said, the Tigers lineup's just a little bit more deep now. Earlier in the season, it was kind of like if you wanted to stack the Tigers, you were just plugging in guys that you felt like had no chance of success. That's not really the case anymore. And so I really don't mind it. They're not pulling much ownership at all, only projected for about a 2% aggregate ownership percentage on DraftKings, about a 4% chance of being the top stack. So you get the Tigers themselves projected to go a little bit under owned. And then you also get, negative correlation against a 50% owned Tyler Mahle. So again, not a super high probability spot, but I do think that the payoffs when it comes through are pretty high. So it's a good spot to get to in tournaments, I think.
Yeah. So to me, the key just here is that we have Tyler Mahle on FanDuel projected for 36.6% ownership. Over on DraftKings, projected for 52% ownership. I get the pitching options are overall not terrific today. However, I don't think that there's any slate where Tyler Mahle is really deserving of this kind of ownership, especially when he's this expensive. 10,200 on DK, 9,600 on FanDuel. So in terms of the amount, obviously early in the day, so nothing that you're married to here, but what kind of exposure, if this was the data we had on Tyler Mahle, do you think you would be getting to if Flock was right now?
It's tough because we have Tyler Mahle on DraftKings with a 37% chance of being the top two pitcher. The next closest guy is Julio Urias at 23.8%. So that is a pretty big gap there. And it makes me think that Mahle does deserve to get quite a bit of ownership. I think typically in situations like this, I end up around the field, if not a little bit lower, but definitely would expect to be closer to the field on Mahle than I am in a lot of situations where it's like, oh, he's, 1.1 times as likely to be a top two pitcher and getting 4 times as much ownership. It's not quite that kind of case here.
And it's hard to find pivots. So the build I made this morning, I ended up with Tyler Mahle in more than half my lineups. And it's not even because I look at it and be like, oh, he's a terrific play. Just I don't know where else to go.
Exactly.
And we're gonna talk about some pivots as we go along. And some of the Coors Field pitchers, there's a case to be made for them. I certainly like Herman Marquez and Ian Anderson more than the respective 1% projected ownerships. But I don't know that there's a Coors Field game where it's like I just want to be married to playing 30% of the Coors Field pitchers. So it's really, and also the other options like Joe Musgrove, who's our least favorite pitcher in all of MLB DFS. So it's like, how much Joe Musgrove do I want to get at the same time either? So there's still a level of security that I feel with Tyler Mahle. On the other side of the game, it is going to be Matt Boyd on the mound for Detroit. Matt Boyd as a low-owned SP2 option, I can get behind, but he's picking up 5% ownership. That seems about reasonable to me.
Yeah, agreed. I think one of the worst takes I've ever had was, I guess 2 years ago, I thought the Astros should have been willing to give up Yordan Alvarez for Matt Boyd. Holy hell, what a bad take that turned out to be. Good thing for the Astros, they did not listen to me. But yeah, he has really gone downhill for the season, only a 19.3% strikeout percentage. He hasn't given up as much power as we've seen in the past, 0.96 home runs per 9, but a 4.88 xFIP. It's, I think, a pretty tough spot for Boyd. Like you said, though, not a ton of good pitching on this slate. He is only 5,800. There used to be talent in his arm. I don't really know where it went, but he threw 71 pitches in his return from, I believe, the injured list on August 29th. So I'm expecting him to be able to go deep enough into this game that that's not really a concern. It's more so just that even though, like Josh and I talked about it yesterday, the Reds have been really bad against left-handed pitching this year, it still doesn't totally make sense to me as far as, like, whenever you talk about teams against left-handed pitching, it's naturally going to be a relatively small sample size. And when you look at this team, it just, like, in terms of priors, I still don't really understand why we would expect them to continue being bad. When you have India, Stevenson, Castellanos, Votto, who hits everyone well, Farmer and Suarez, both right-handed, Aquino's right-handed, it doesn't make a ton of sense that you would expect them to keep being bad. So even though they have been so far, I still think it's a pretty dangerous spot. Like you said, about 5%, we have Boyd at 16% ownership on DraftKings.
I have to refresh then.
That would be that's a lot. I wouldn't expect to get over the field on that. Right now we have him with an 8% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, 16% ownership. By comparison, you have Daniel Lynch, who we'll talk about later. Tough matchup against the White Sox, but same price point, 9% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, only 0.5% ownership right now. So pretty easy pivot if you wanted to get away from Boyd.
Yeah, by the way, this is a very exciting moment for me because a power line came down on my street the other day, and the garbage only comes once a week, and it was supposed to be yesterday, and it didn't come, and they just ended up coming now, and I have so much garbage out front. So I was very excited while you were talking. The Matt Boyd ownership update, that was also exciting to find out that he's 16% owned, because that does seem crazy to me. And, I get on this slate, we don't have very many cheap starting pitching options to really get to, or by the way, pitching options in general that we like, but considering that Matt Boyd is picking up 16% ownership, the Cincinnati Reds, they look about fairly owned as a stack, but I think I'm going to have to prioritize them a little bit more heavily anyway, just because of all the ownership going to Boyd.
Yeah, agreed. Like I said, I just have a hard time buying into this team not being good. Like, I have no issue getting to India or Stevenson or Castellanos or pretty much anyone else in this lineup. It's a good park to hit in. They have a 5.5 implied run total. The biggest risk you're taking is just that, we've seen for years Matt Boyd be a good strikeout pitcher, and we haven't seen him pitch a ton this year. So there's certainly a chance that he just comes back from the injured list and starts striking us out again. But he's always been someone that gives up power too. So I just not really that concerned about taking hitters, right-handed power hitters against Boyd in this park.
Yeah, and then you look through the lineup. There are some expensive hitters, but once again, there's nothing here that's outrageously priced. Especially when you consider that if you're making a red stack, maybe you don't include Tyler Mahle, there aren't that many pitchers to pay up for. So I think it's easy enough to pay up for offense today. Nick Castellanos, the only player in the lineup priced over 5K on DK. So in offense, I don't really have too much of an issue getting to. Next game that we have here on the slate, it is the Milwaukee Brewers against the St. Louis Cardinals. Adrian Hauser on the mound against Kwang Hung Kim. And these are two pitchers that I generally don't really ever roster. Kim just because of a lack of strikeout upside, Hauser because he doesn't generally work deep into games. But considering the context of this slate with pretty slim pickings at pitching, do either of them stand out to you at all?
Yeah, both guys are guys I'm with you. I normally don't really roster. Kim for the season has only struck out 18.3% of hitters, 4.59 xFIP. He's been okay as a real life pitcher, but the strikeout percentage just isn't that appealing. I could see getting to him on this slate, again, just because there's not a lot of options. But looking at his recent games, I think is pretty concerning as well in terms of how many pitches he's throwing. It seems like St. Louis has really dialed him back a bit. Over his last 5 starts, he's gone 4, 2 2/3, 4, 2 2/3, and 6. Hasn't thrown more than 84 pitches in any of those. Threw 64 pitches against Pittsburgh his last time out. Gave up 1 run in 4 innings. It's not like he was getting hit hard. Threw 46 pitches in 2 2/3 against the Tigers the game before that. I think it's pretty tough to trust him in terms of, one, his ability to rack up DFS points, and 2, it seems like the Cardinals are just kind of trying to get him out of the game before he goes through the lineup a third time. So that's concerning. He's pulling 1% ownership right now. So if you have a lineup where, you are using more popular hitters, you can certainly mix him in, but it's tough to prioritize with all the things that I think are kind of working against him. On the other side with Hauser, he has been throwing more pitches lately, which is good to see. He's not a horrible pitcher either, but again, not someone that picks up a lot of strikeouts. In his last start, he threw 94 pitches, threw 68 the one before that, 104 3 starts ago. So you've kind of seen him bounce around, but he has gone at least 5 innings in 3 of his last 4. The Cardinals are a pretty tough matchup, though. Not a lot of strikeouts in this lineup. Hauser only has a 17.3% strikeout percentage for the season, 4.46 xFIP. He is also not pulling much ownership. He's at 5%. I think between the two, I would lean towards Hauser just because I feel a little bit more confident in how many pitches he can throw at this point. But I think they're pretty similar in that they are relatively low upside pitchers with pretty legitimate question marks in terms of how deep they're going to go into the game and in terms of matchup, but they're also cheap. There's not a lot of pitching on this slate and they're not getting ownership. So getting to them a little bit if you're playing, 150 lineups makes sense.
Yeah, and for me, I'm not sure if I'm going to or not. Ultimately, I think the upside might just really be an issue for me. And Hauser, maybe this isn't a fair way to look at him because we've seen him throw a little bit more pitches recently. The last time he scored over 18 fantasy points was July 2nd, and that was against Pittsburgh. And also, like you said, not a high strikeout guy. His last handful of start strikeouts for Hauser, 4.24, 2.21. So I'm just not sure that there's a whole lot of upside there that's going to make me want to get to him. But we'll see by the time that the dust settles and where the ownership is for everybody. But in terms of offenses here, are either of them priorities for you?
No, I think it's it's just a weird game. Like, it's hard for me to get to the pitching. It's difficult for me to get to a lot of the bats. Neither pitcher is pulling ownership, so it's not going to drive up either offense from a negative correlation standpoint. Milwaukee right now, fifth lowest top stack percentage at 4%. Granted, there are a bunch of teams lumped in there, but projected for 7% aggregate ownership. St. Louis, 4.5% top stack percentage, 2.5% aggregate ownership. So if I were going to one side, I guess I would lean towards St. Louis just because they are getting a little bit less ownership. You have a really good value in Dylan Carlson at 3,200, O'Neill at 3,900 against a pitcher that doesn't get strikeouts is pretty appealing. You have to pay up for guys like Goldschmidt and Arenado, but I don't think it'll be that difficult to do on this slate anyway. I think the Brewers are getting ownership because they are basically mispriced here. Kim, like I said, he's having a decent year in terms of run prevention, but seems like he's gotten a bit lucky as well. 3.32 ERA compared to a 4.59 xFIP. He's managed to strand 77% of runners as well, which is probably a little bit high. And then looking at Milwaukee's pricing on DraftKings, you have a $4,100 Adames that's very cheap. Avisail Garcia, if he's in the lineup, is only $3,600. Christian Yelich is down to $4,400 for whatever reason. Escobar is at $45. I mean, this is a team that I want to say it was like a week ago, you had to pay like $5,700 for the middle of this order. So I think that's why they're getting the ownership. It makes sense in terms of a point per dollar projection standpoint, but I think in terms of just their chances of being the slate winning team, they're just going a little bit over-owned compared to very similar offenses elsewhere.
Yeah, and I'm just refreshing some of the individual ownership to see where Lorenzo Cain is at. So, yeah, if I want to differentiate, the one that makes the most sense to me, Lorenzo Cain is only 2,300 and projected for 3% ownership on DraftKings. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Lorenzo Cain, who's been hitting higher in the order as of late, actually not really higher in the order. I'm not sure why a projected lineup has him second right now, but he's been playing better as of late. So the last few games for Lorenzo Cain, he appears to be healthy, which was an issue for him earlier in the year, but $2,300 for Lorenzo Cain at 3%. That's just a mispriced and a player who I think warrants more ownership given his history as a fantasy producer.
Agreed.
Other than that, looking through some of the individual ownerships, what I think is actually another way to pretty easily reduce the ownership share. Jace Peterson's currently projected for 12.5% ownership. If you want to make a Brewer stack and leave off Chase Peterson, I think that's another way to reasonably reduce ownership. Maybe get Lorenzo Cain in there instead. Maybe somebody like Luis Urias. So there's definitely, they're a little bit popular, but I think somebody like Chase Peterson, who's currently projected for the most ownership on the team, an easy enough guy to leave out of those stacks. Next game that we have here, it is going to be Daniel Lynch on the mound for KC against Ronaldo Lopez for the Chicago White Sox. And Lopez has struggled in the past. He's always had really good stuff, a really good fastball. And if you just watched him on the eye test, you watched him throw an inning or two, you'd always expect that Ronaldo Lopez is a really effective high strikeout pitcher. That's never really been the case until this year. He's kind of starting to put it together. He did it mostly out of the bullpen. He's transitioning to a starter role, and it's something that he's had some success in now. What do you make of Ronaldo Lopez and how well he's pitched lately?
I still have very, very little trust in him just because we have such a long track record of Ronaldo Lopez doing this thing where he puts together a few good starts and you're like, okay, this is why he at one point was one of the top pitching prospects in baseball. He was a key piece of the Adam Eaton deal. And then he just kind of falls off the tracks again. So I'm still not super confident in him, but what stands out is that he's only 6,300. Pitching on the slate isn't very good. He's not projected for any ownership right now. Maybe that changes as the day goes on, but this is another guy where he's $500 more than Matt Boyd. Yeah, there are concerns I have for Lopez, but it's not like I don't have concerns for Boyd as well. I don't think Boyd should be getting 16 times the ownership. I don't think Colby Allard should be getting 15 times the ownership. I think I would want to just kind of balance those ownership percentages out. In his last appearance, Lopez threw 9 pitches. That was September 1st, but he threw 59 pitches on the 27th. He threw 75 on the 22nd. I'm expecting that you can get around 5 innings from Lopez. Like you said, the strikeout numbers have been pretty solid this year. In his 4 major league starts, he has struck out 26.8% of hitters. So it's nice to see that so far he's carried his strikeout numbers as a starter as well. Kansas City is a pretty tough team to strike out, but they don't have a ton of good hitters in their lineup either. So I'm more than willing to roll the dice on Lopez at a cheap price tag.
Yeah, and it's as long as the ownership stays low, he's worth how deep is he going to go into the game? I don't really know. It's a little bit up in the air. There's a little bit of uncertainty there. But for 1% ownership on a slate where he's 6,300 and the pitching kind of sucks, I'm willing to get to him and roll a dice on that. If he ends up being more popular, we get to lock and he's 15 to 20% on, I'll feel differently. But right now, just in the interest of trying to differentiate off of some of these more popular cheap starting pitchers, I'd rather get to Ronaldo Lopez than than Matt Boyd when Boyd is picking up 15x the ownership. So that's where I kind of think the comparison is to make here. Now, on the other side, Daniel Lynch is going to be on the mound for Kansas City. And Lynch is a pitcher you and I have discussed a decent amount this year, probably more than he warrants being discussed, but he's a young prospect, considered one of the best overall pitching prospects in baseball. He has terrific stuff, 94.1 average fastball velocity. The results for him this year overall haven't been great, but that's kind of expected with some growing pains for a young pitcher. But I think that if he's able to keep the ball in the strike zone, which is a pretty big if, he's been walking a whole bunch of guys recently, the stuff is good enough that I think he does have tournament upside.
Yeah, and he has looked better since coming back from his demotion. His overall numbers this year are a little bit skewed because he was absolute garbage to start the season. His DraftKings points through his 3 starts before his demotion were 5.7, negative 19.3, and 3.8. So those throw his numbers off a little bit. Since coming back, his numbers overall still aren't great. He has a 19.3% strikeout percentage, 9.9% walk percentage, 4.75 xFIP over 7 starts, 40 and a third innings. Those numbers aren't very good. But the thing that makes me feel a little bit better is that, for one, he's throwing a lot of pitches. He threw 104 last time out, 88, 98, 100, 95. So you're getting a really cheap pitcher that they're letting throw pitches. But also the strength of schedule he's had since coming back from the minors is pretty absurd. His first start was against Detroit. He carved them up like you would hope that he would. But then he faced Toronto, the White Sox, the Yankees, Houston twice, and then the Mariners in his last start. And he's held his own. Like I said, I read those numbers off and they're not great, but they're not horrible, especially for a $5,400 pitcher. A tough matchup again here against the White Sox. But this is another guy where it's just, to me, the range of outcomes is basically identical to somebody like Matt Boyd or Colby Allard. He's just not getting nearly the ownership. I think he's a pretty good option in tournaments.
Yeah, and on the flip side, I think this is a spot I want to be overweight to both sides of. I think that Daniel Lynch, it feels to me like there's one of two outcomes here. He's either going to be able to throw strikes today, and he's going to be really good because he has really good stuff, or he's going to do some of the stuff that we've seen in some recent starts where he's struggled with his control at times and gets hit hard, which if that is going to be the case, then there's a lot of upside in the White Sox, who we currently have projected to have the second best odds of being the top scoring team on the slate. And they're going a little bit under-owned. And most of the teams around them in terms of top stack odds are going over-owned. So I look at this game as 5% Lynch. I probably want to be somewhere around 10% of him. But then the Chicago White Sox at 8.6% projected ownership as a team, I want to be well over that number as well.
Yeah, I see it the same way. Like, part of the reason that I'm interested in Lynch as a DFS pitcher is that I think there's volatility there because he's a young pitcher that has talent. He has had some issues this year, but we've also seen him, take some strides forward. But on the other side, that volatility goes the other way too. We've seen plenty of bad Daniel Lynch, not saying, that I expect him to be a bad pitcher or consistently be bad, but he's been far from dominant so far. And there's a ton of right-handed power in this White Sox lineup, and they're not getting that much ownership, like you said. So if they were pulling more, if they were getting ownership similarly to teams like Colorado or the Braves or something like that, I'd back away. But right now they look like they're going a little bit under-owned, and I think there is certainly a nice ceiling against Lynch. So going to both sides makes plenty of sense to me.
Yeah, and then on the other side, like we mentioned with Ronaldo Lopez starting for the White Sox, in the past, there's been some inconsistencies with him as a starter. Most of his success this year has come out of the bullpen, and we've seen him pitch well as a starter recently, but it's hard to know if that's smoke and mirrors or not just because it's such a limited sample size. But we've got Arcafelza in the YouTube chat. He's saying that he likes a KC stack today. Is that something you agree with?
I don't have a problem with it. Like, they're not pulling ownership, and like I kind of said at the top, to me, this slate just kind of sets up as I just want to be where there's not ownership because I'm not confident in much. Like, I think it's just a lot of spots where it's just like, yeah, this is essentially a coin flip how it goes. So I'll just be where, I'll take whatever the field doesn't want. Kansas City's projected for 1% ownership right now. So I think it's fine. There's certainly volatility on Lopez as well. I feel a little bit more confident saying if I had to choose one side between Lopez or the Kansas City offense, I would lean toward Lopez. Whereas with Lynch, I really couldn't tell you, like in 3 max or single entry, which side I end up with between Lynch and Chicago. So I'll say that. But, again, it's still a relatively high upside spot. Lopez has been basically neutral at controlling the running game throughout his career as well, which with a team like Kansas City, I think is, I don't want to say a plus, but it's at least not bad. Like, I would expect them to at least try and run on him. Whereas yesterday I did have some concerns about if they would even attempt to run on Dallas Keuchel or not. That's something that you definitely would like to have with Kansas City since they don't have a ton of power in their lineup, but they do have a lot of speed, especially with Adalberto Mondesi coming back as well. So I think it's an okay spot, not getting much ownership. I would prefer the White Sox side. I would prefer Lopez, but if you're playing 150 lineups, I'd expect to get to Kansas City too.
Yeah, and bringing up Adalberto Mondesi, who has now played 2 games since coming off the injured list. It's been basically a lost season for him. Definitely has a lot of fantasy upside going forward and for future seasons. The question is just how often he's going to be on the field. And I think there's also some concerns with all the leg injuries he's had. Is that something that could ultimately take away from his ability to steal bases? To this point, the answer appears to be no. We've seen him only back for 2 games now after missing so much time. And he stole bases in each of those 2 games. Stole a base against Dallas Keuchel yesterday, and then also had a stolen base off of, I forget who it was that was pitching for Cleveland the game before, but that aside, 2 games back for Adalberto Mondesi, 2 stolen bases, only 1% projected ownership. So if I have to pick out one Royals bat to play, even if it's just as a one-off today, it is going to be Mondesi for me at low ownership. Is there any other individual bat that you like getting to here?
Nicky Lopez at 3,700 batting second. I think he gives you stolen base upside as well, which is nice. Carlos Santana is only 2,900 batting cleanup. That's a pretty absurd price tag. And then I think has to be said every slate. Salvador Perez, one of the best hitting catchers in baseball, may or may not play today, though, has the Q tag on him. So if he's out, that does weaken Kansas City's lineup quite a bit, but it also makes them less expensive.
Yeah, it's a little hard to get to from a lineup construction standpoint. He's 5,900 on DK. But once again, only 1.7% projected ownership. That is a number that I will almost certainly be over the top of, because if I'm playing cheaper stacks or cheaper pitchers, I think it just always kind of makes sense to end up paying up for Salvador Perez in some of those lineups. Next game we've here to talk about it is the Seattle Mariners in Arizona to take on the Diamondbacks. Now, Marco Gonzalez is going to be on the mound for Seattle, and it's been a tale of, I won't even say 2 seasons for him. It's been 80% of the season he was absolutely awful, but over the last month, all of a sudden, Marco Gonzalez has once again kind of become a quality pitcher, and it's been a long time since we've seen Marco Gonzalez look good. It's a favorable matchup for him against Arizona. He's pulling a little bit of ownership, but all things considered, I kind of like this spot for Marco Gonzalez, considering that, number one, it's going to be a National League park. He gets to face a pitcher instead of a DH. And the other thing, too, the Diamondbacks don't have a good offense. So Marco Gonzalez is not a pitcher I've been rostering this year, but considering the success he's had over the last month, I think I'm going to be on him today.
I would expect to be around the field on him. I just have a hard time taking a huge stand on a $9,300 Gonzalez. Even recently, when he's been pitching better, like you said, over his last 5 starts, only an 18.5% strikeout percentage, still a 4.79 xFIP. Looking at his expected numbers over the last 30 days, which is those 5 starts, 117 expected ISO to righties is good, 256 expected ISO, or expected WOBA rather, but still only a 15.8% strikeout percentage. He's just at a price point now where it's I don't think the Diamondbacks are very likely to have a big game against him, but it also just seems really unlikely that Gonzalez puts up a game that I really have to have. So given the lack of alternatives, I don't, if I'm playing 150 lineups, I would expect to have some Gonzalez, but it's just really hard for me to get him in a lot of lineups when he's this expensive, and I still don't think he's that good.
Yeah, and that's fair. He's also 8,400 on FanDuel. I think he's probably a little bit more favorable play on FanDuel than DK, but yeah, I don't know that now you bring up the 9,300 price tag and some of I was just looking at his FanDuel price there. Maybe I get to him a little bit less in the fields. Like you said, we right now have him projected for 10% ownership. But I don't know. I don't feel very good about any of the pitchers here. So I think that I think there's going to be a lot of guys that I think this is going to be slate. It's going to be a lot of kind of spraying and praying for me. Yeah,
I kind of feel similarly to Gonzalez as I did to Evaldi and Wainwright yesterday, where they were 9,800 and 10K on DraftKings. And it was just I don't like those prices. I think they're overpriced, but I also know that I'm just going to build some lineups where it's I have $9,300 at pitcher. I can't find the money to get up to, Malley or Valdez or, these guys that maybe I prefer. So whatever, Marco Gonzalez is the best projected pitcher that I can land on here and he fits, and I'll take my chances. That's how he gets into some lineups. I'm not looking at it I can't wait to get more Marco Gonzalez and less, Urias or Malley or something. The strikeout numbers are just so bad for him.
Yeah, and then going against him with Arizona, he's pitched well enough as of late, and Arizona's a poor enough offense that I'm not really dying to get to Arizona. They're also picking up a little bit of ownership today, 6.3%. So this is a team that, in terms of stacks, trying to limit my player pool a little bit, but not one that I'm super high on.
Yeah, not really high on Diamondbacks either. Like I said, Gonzalez not striking guys out, but he's not giving up power. He's not giving up production. You could certainly talk me into a $3,100 Nick Ahmed leading off at shortstop. But the problem is then like Ketel Marte is really expensive. Carson Kelly is expensive. Walker, I think, is fine at 3K, but it's just a really tough offense to stack, especially when you have to pay up for like the two guys that you would really like to be in your stack.
And they're popular. We've currently got Carson Kelly projected for 8% ownership, Ketel Marte 7.8%. So it's not like this is a pay up to be contrarian spot with the Arizona Diamondbacks. It's a pay up to get a lot of ownership on an offense that sucks, which is generally not something I want to do, especially in a pitcher, Marco Gonzalez, who appears to be pitching much better now than he did earlier in the season. So for me, the spot for the Diamondbacks, one that I kind of want to be avoiding. On the other side, Humberto Castellanos is going to be on the mound for Arizona. And of the little bit of pitching we've seen Castellanos do this year, what have you made of him?
So he's only made 2 starts in the majors, 9 total appearances, 21 innings. He has a 15.1% strikeout percentage and a 10.5% walk percentage. That is all not good. 5.04 xFIP. What does kind of interest me, though, is he made 12 starts at AAA this year through 57 2/3 innings. At AAA, he struck out 23.9% of hitters with a 5.7% walk percentage. Clearly, going from AAA to the majors, you would expect a step back. But I think going from a 24% strikeout percentage to 15 while doubling your walk percentage is a bigger step back than you typically are going to see. I think there's a good chance you see the strikeout numbers go up moving forward. You see the walk rate come down. And he's only 4K on DraftKings. He threw like 73 pitches his last time out. I don't have any level of confidence in this guy, but you can't really tell me he's worse than a lot of the alternatives.
No, it's I don't know that I'm going to need the salary savings to get to Castellanos, which I think is the key here. We only have him right now projected with a 0.2% chance of being one of the top 2 scoring pitchers on the slate. At a 4K price tag, it's not like you need him to go out and score 25 fantasy points, depending on what the other options are. Maybe Coors Field goes off. Then Castellanos could end in the optimal lineup by scoring like 12 to 14 fantasy points just because you get a lot of production out of the offenses. As of right now, in the build I made, I didn't have him in. If somebody said they're playing him a small amount for 4K, I wouldn't have an issue with it. I just don't know that I'm going to need those salary savings. The other thing also for me is on the other side of the game, I like the Seattle Mariners offense. On this slate, we only have 2 teams that are projected for an over 5% chance of being a top scoring team on the slate that are under-owned right now. One of them being the Chicago White Sox that we've already talked about. The other one being the Seattle Mariners. The other teams that we have projected with an over 5% chance of being the top stack of the day, the Reds, the Angels, the Dodgers, the Rockies, the Braves, these are all teams that are negatively leveraged. So to me, I kind of look at those numbers, and Seattle, Chicago, those become 2 priority teams for me to get to.
Yeah, I agree with both of your points there. Like, we've already talked about so many cheap pitchers, and there's more to come, where like you said, the savings just may not end up being necessary. Like, for example, if I'm playing a lineup that has Matt Boyd or Daniel Lynch and Jose Suarez or something, that's like $12,000 a pitcher. I'm not going to need to spend $10,000 a pitcher. I'll be fine. I can still get whatever bats I want. Even if you're paying up for Tyler Mahle, in a lot of cases, there's just not going to be a need to go even further down the Castellanos. So I agree, he probably isn't necessary in a lot of lineups. I just think that, like, I still think he's underpriced at 4K, but probably not that necessary. And then I'm with you on Seattle as well. You've got the Dodgers projected to be overowned, Colorado and Atlanta, both sides of course, projected to be overowned. Seattle has a 4.8 implied run total here. Not the best hitting environment. The roof closed in Arizona, but pretty decent pricing on the Mariners. We know Haniger and Seager are good. Crawford's not great, but he's not that expensive. Toro and France are relatively inexpensive. And then the bottom of the order is essentially free. So it's another situation where, I made the case for why I could see, getting Castellanos in some lineups, but it's not a case where it's like, oh, I think this guy's really good. It's a case of like, oh, he's probably a little bit better than his price tag. That doesn't mean that the hitters against him are in a bad spot, because it was a completely DFS related argument. It was not a talent related argument. I think he's probably a below average pitcher, and the Mariners are in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, and looking at some of the hitters in the lineup, also guys who are not picking up that much ownership. JP Crawford, he usually leads off 5% ownership. He's under 4K. Abraham Toro, 3% ownership. He's under 4K. Other guys at the end of the order are oddly more popular, like Kelenic at 2,200, 6% owned. Marmolos right now, 7%. But some of those guys towards the top of the order that are also cheap, that just not picking up enough ownership, in my opinion. So Ty France, JP Crawford, Abraham Toro, those are the guys that are really like the most relative to the price and ownership. So Those are going to be my two most rostered teams today, I believe, the Seattle Mariners and the Chicago White Sox. Next game we have here to talk about, it is the Coors Field game, German Marquez against Ian Anderson. Tough game to really figure here because Coors Field, obviously we know about the upside that offenses have, but these pitchers are both pretty good. Like, this is about as good as we're going to see these teams throughout in terms of pitching. So first I want to ask you, do you have interest in the pitchers in this game?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they're not getting ownership, and they are just more talented than 90% of the pitchers going today. Like, and also the good pitchers for the most part don't have really good matchups either. Malley has a perfectly fine matchup against the Tigers, but Julio Urias is facing the Giants. That's pretty rough. Musgrove's facing Houston. Valdez is facing San Diego. So it's not like we're going to talk about these top end pitchers and say, oh, it's a really good spot. Like, I don't have any concerns here. So the fact that Marquez is pitching in Coors against the Braves, of course that's concerning, but when you're comparing it to the alternatives, it's a little bit less concerning since you're not, you don't have, it's not like these guys are facing the Rangers or the Pirates or something. So that helps. And then only 2% projected ownership going to Marquez at 8,100 here. We have him projected for a 15.7% chance of being a top two pitcher, only 2% ownership. For comparison, the guys sandwiching him, Valdez and Suarez, in terms of top two pitcher percentage, are projected for 11 and 21% ownership. So it just seems like he's going a little bit under-owned. And then on top of that, Atlanta is projected to be the highest owned team on the slate by a very wide margin. So if Marquez does pitch well, Atlanta's not having a good game, it's kind of just like a path of least resistance thing where there's a lot of questionable pitching on this slate. If you're in lineups where you don't have the Braves, instead of going to other questionable pitching, why not just say, okay, I already don't have the Braves. If they go off, I'm going to lose. There's not really a bunch of additional risk in taking Marquez at that point, because if the Braves go off, you're going to lose one way or the other. You may as well have the guy that negatively correlates with them. And it's not like he's not good. Like at Coors Field this year, 23.9% strikeout percentage, 3.51 xFIP. His strikeout percentage is lower at home and his walk percentage is higher. That's to be expected, but still a good pitcher overall. It's not a spot that I'm confident in, but there's not really any spots I'm confident in today. So why not?
This is going to make or break me tonight. German Marquez is my favorite play on the entire slate as of right now. Just considering, but we still have a lot of time until the slate locks. But if this is the data that holds true to lock, we have German Marquez, like you said, projected for 2% ownership at 8,100 on a slate that just has terrible pitching options. Over on FanDuel, 1% ownership at 8,000. And then you look at the Braves on the other side, like you said, they're going to be massively popular. We have them projected for a 21% ownership share. That is more than double any other team on the slate. So we have the Braves. And once again, German Marquez is a quality pitcher. We have the Braves as the most negatively leveraged stack by a very wide margin. So by my process, when I look at teams where it's like, oh, we have a pitcher who's under-owned going up against an offense that's over-owned, that rings a lot of bells for me. I'm going to be really high on German Marquez. The chance of it succeeding on any individual one slate is not all that great, but over the long haul, something that Adam likes to bring up also, it's about when you win on these slates, the payouts are bigger than the ones where maybe you're just playing the chalk. So that's one of the spots I like going to Marquez today. It's certainly something that's very risky, but I think that all the data points that being a good GPP option. On the other side, how are you going to be handling Brave stacks though?
I expect to be under the field just because they are projected for so much ownership relative to other teams. Of course, it's a high upside spot. And with how much Atlanta I played the last 2 days and they kind of sucked, I'm sure they will light up Marquez if I don't play them. But it just right now, I think it looks like there's more of an edge, more of, like you said, when you're right, you're going to get paid off better going to the Marquez side and or just going to different offenses than going to the Braves side here. I just don't really want to compete. I don't really want to stack against German Marquez a bunch of times if the reward for that coming through is that I get to play against 20% of the field that did the same thing. I think there's enough other high upside spots on the slate with all of the bad pitching we've talked about that the way it looks right now, I just don't really anticipate getting to a ton of Atlanta. I'll take my chances that they just don't break the slate open.
Yeah, and then, I mean, you look at some of the ownership here, too. It's high everywhere. There's no guy at the end of the order right now. And, who knows? Maybe somebody gets rested and something else opens up. But right now we have Adam Duvall project for 14% ownership, Dansby Swanson 14%, Austin Riley 17%. Every other player on the team is well over 20% projected ownership. So it's a very popular offense, and there is no way to reduce that ownership share. There is no 8-hitter in the lineup. There's no, at least now, no like Adrian's a projected to be in the lineup at 4% ownership. Everybody's popular. All the more reason that I like German Marquez. So every single hitter in the Braves lineup, I expect them going to be underweight to. I'm not going to have 0% Braves stacks, but I'm going to have well under the field, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4 or 5%, which is certainly less than the field has. But on the other side, then we have kind of a similar situation with Ian Anderson against the Rockies. Not to quite the same extreme, but Ian Anderson, I think, is good, not quite as good as Herman Marquez. The Rockies offense at home, maybe not good overall, but they benefit enough from the park factors that it makes them obviously a pretty tough task for any kind of offense there. But Ian Anderson is my second favorite GPP pitcher on the slate. I don't like him as much as Marquez, but this could go very poorly. This could easily be a 6-5 game in the third inning and be like, oh, cool, well, my lineup's going to score negative fantasy points. But I like Ian Anderson also quite a bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you talk about the Anderson and Rockies matchup, I view it very similarly to the Marquez and Braves one, just like a little bit more muted. Like Anderson's not as good as Marquez. I'm not as scared to take bats against him, but also the Rockies aren't as good as the Braves. I don't want to roster them as much as the Braves. And, ownership aside, I wouldn't want to get to the Rockies as much. So it's kind of the same thing. Like the Rockies are going to be popular. Anderson is good. He threw 86 pitches his last time out, which is good to see. One other thing that I like about him is with this game being in Coors, it makes me feel a little bit better that he is a fastball changeup guy. He does throw a curveball as well around 20% of the time, but it makes me feel a little bit better that the stuff that he relies on is typically stuff that isn't going to be as negatively affected by the altitude, I don't think. And he's cheap. So, I don't have a lot of confidence here, but he's projected for 1% ownership. You look at the pitchers around him, he is so much more talented than guys like Adrian Hauser and Kim and the guys that are a little bit cheaper. I don't mind it. And again, like if you don't have the Rockies in your lineup, if you don't have the Rockies in a lineup, what is the real advantage to going to, a Hauser or a Kim or something like that, when you could just go to the more talented pitcher and you've already accepted if the Rockies do well, that lineup's not going to win anyway.
Yeah, and the Rockies, I do think, is a slightly more favorable stack than the Braves just from an ownership standpoint, because number one, they're just picking up less ownership as a team. But then number two, I think there are some individual plays here that make sense. And one guy that I do plan on being overweight to the field on that I like is a one-off. Charlie Blackmon is only projected for 6% ownership, and that seems a little off to me for a guy who, on the whole is not quite the player he used to be, but still at home at Coors Field, Charlie Blackmon's a player who is capable of having success. He's homered in a couple of games in a row, and low ownership for Charlie Blackmon at Coors Field. I think that is a sensible play for me. Anything else that you like from this Rockies team?
I agree with you on Blackmon. He really just hasn't been getting much ownership. If Tapia is leading off, he's really cheap. But yeah, I think that between the two teams, clearly I trust Atlanta more, for lack of a better word, but we have Atlanta with basically a one and a half times the chance of being the top stack, but getting double the ownership. So I would get to Colorado stacks before I get to Atlanta.
Yeah, I definitely anticipate them going to have more of the Rockies than Atlanta. And once again, this is a game that is absolutely going to make or break me, and most likely break me, but who knows? Maybe if it goes the right way, then it's certainly one that I expect to pay out well. Now, the next game, my least favorite pitcher that really exists in the world, that is Joe Musgrove, is going to be on mound for the San Diego Padres. Really tough matchup against the Houston Astros. This dude, Joe Musgrove, sometimes he's good, sometimes he sucks, and that's really the only two versions of him. There is no in-between. Joe Musgrove, these are his last handful of starts, although he's been the better version a little bit more recently. He's coming off a game where he scored 44 fantasy points against the Angels. Time before that, 26 fantasy points against the Phillies. And then, of course, in one of the easiest matchups possible against the Arizona Diamondbacks, he scored 0 fantasy points. So this Joe Musgrove, he's so difficult to predict. He's all over the place. I am on the wrong side of him all the time. Here's just the stance I've been taking with Joe Musgrove as of late. Whatever his ownership is, I'm going to be somewhere in the same neighborhood. Today we have him projected for 18% on FanDuel. On DK's projected for 38% ownership. That's a little rich for me. I'm going to have him in my player pool, but I don't know that I could get to quite that number unless it comes down. I've been trying to even myself with the field on Joe Musgrove, so it doesn't make or break me, but I just don't want to play him that much.
The way it looks right now, I think probably my biggest pitching stand would be being under the field on Musgrove on DraftKings. The ownership maybe changes between now and lock, but right now you have 38% ownership going to Musgrove with a 22% chance of being a top 2 pitcher. Julio Urias has a 24% chance. He's getting about half the ownership. Framber Valdez, both these guys are a little bit more expensive, but only by like $1,000 or so. Framber Valdez, 17% chance, getting 1/3 the ownership. And then Marquez, basically, or with like a 16% chance, but getting, 1/15 the ownership. I think that Musgrove looks drastically overowned compared to the pitchers with a similar range of outcomes. It's a really tough matchup against Houston. Yes, they lose the designated hitter, so it's a little bit weaker lineup, and Musgrove certainly does have strikeout upside, but it's still a really tough matchup. I don't really, and you're not getting like a huge discount on Musgrove either. So I don't really understand why he's getting as much ownership as he is given the spot. I don't think that it's like a drastic, of course the park is better, but like, I don't think this is a drastically better spot than German Marquez has in terms of upside.
And also, obviously, the matchup against Houston is so far from ideal, but I'm going to ask you a question that may be unfair because I think it's almost impossible to answer. Cash games, Tyler Mahle, easy SP1 on DK. FanDuel, if you're playing cash games, you play Tyler Mahle. Who would be the second pitcher to go to today?
Suarez?
I think I'd probably be inclined to go to Suarez also just because of the price point. It's so scary. Like, what is Joe Musgrove going to be like 60% owned in cash games, this kind of ownership?
I don't think he should. I don't know. It's tough. It's tough. Like, you're not going to feel good about whoever it is. I kind of just want to spend as little money as I can and get the bats that I want. I'm crunching now. I'm crunching now just using Alex's projections to see what ends up happening.
I would say that maybe Julio Urias would be an option, but I don't like that matchup in San Francisco either. But
I like Urias too, especially in tournaments. But like, it just kind of feels like, oh, I'm gonna pay more money to make myself feel a little bit better about the name of the person I'm rostering, but he's still probably going to score like 16 fantasy points.
Yeah, can we just ban Joe Musgrove slates? This guy's the worst. If I go heavy on Joe Musgrove, he scores negative 15 fantasy points. If I'm light on him, he strikes out 15 hitters and scores like 50. He's the most inconsistent, unpredictable player we have.
I didn't even make sure the player pool was right. I just, whatever players were in the player pool initially on Fantasy Cruncher, but using Alex's projections, I crunched the top 20 projected lineups. They all have Mahle, 85% have Musgrove, 10% have Suarez, 5% have Urias. Kind of looking through the lineups, though, I think I prefer it's tough. Because the thing is, the Braves are so cheap, too. Like, Soler is really cheap. D'Arnaud's really cheap, so it makes it easy. Like, basically, the difference between the number one lineup, which has Musgrove, and then the first lineup that has Suarez is it just goes from Jack Mayfield as a third base punt to Kyle Seager, who clearly I like Seager, but not entirely sure that's worth going from Musgrove to Suarez when that's the only change in your lineup.
Yeah, and listen, like Musgrove, like we said, crazy inconsistent. Anybody who's played Joe Musgrove this year has been on both sides of it. You've had days where like, oh, cool, Joe Musgrove scored a bunch of fantasy points for me. And then I'm sure that you were one of the 50% of the people who played him against Arizona also, where it was like, oh, that really sucked. For that reason, only 1% ownership going to Houston. I think this is a good leverage stack to get to. Joe Musgrove looks a little bit overowned. We know how inconsistent he is. If this is the bad version of Joe Musgrove that shows up, Houston Astros have a ton of upside.
I'm so tired of saying I want to stack this team. I don't know how they're one of the best offenses in baseball because they never score any runs, but it's the same thing. Like, it's a tough matchup against Musgrove, and there are plenty of good matchups on this slate, so that makes it a little bit tougher to get to Houston. But if he's going to continue to pull this much ownership and I think be probably the most over-owned pitcher relative to his chances of success, it's going to make Houston look good. This is an offense that clearly can go off against anyone. I certainly don't put Musgrove in that elite tier of pitchers that I'm just absolutely not taking offenses against. So yeah, it's a low probability spot, but it's baseball. Like, you're going to lose most baseball slates regardless of what you do. You may as well put yourself in a position to make a lot of money when it goes your way, because it's just such a volatile sport that, you know, it's not like basketball saying like, oh, I'm going to take this like crazy 3% stand and then hope to be right, because you're going to be wrong so often because it's so much more projectable. In baseball, it's kind of just like nobody is good at guessing what's going to happen any one given night. So you may as well just put yourself in a position to make the most money when it happens to go your way. And Houston.
Yeah, and by the way, not only the best offense in baseball, it isn't particularly close by WRC plus over the entire season. Now, if you had to say who the best offense is right now, I would say the Dodgers, just because they have everybody healthy and they have Trey Turner in the lineup now, which they didn't have earlier in the year. But for the season, the Astros have a 117 WRC plus. The second ranked offense in baseball is the Toronto Blue Jays at a 110 WRC plus. For reference, the difference between the Astros and the Dodgers for the season is about the same difference between the Dodgers and the Nationals. That's how good the Astros offense has been on the whole. Now, certainly lately, it hasn't felt like that's been the case. I know as somebody who's been stacking them a lot, so I'm a little curious to just look at their splits in the second half of the season and see what the best offenses have been, because at least in my personal biases, it feels like the Houston Astros have not come through for me a whole bunch recently. But no, even second half of the season, they have a 112 WRC plus. I guess they just score like 5 or 6 runs every single night.
Well, and I think the one night a week I don't play them, they score 16, so that drives it up.
Well, that's fair. So we'll have to let everybody know when that one day is they don't play. It's probably whatever day they end up being chalk, and that's just the big night for the Houston Astros. But
I did it a week ago. I don't remember who they were facing or why I wasn't on them. I was just like, I can't get to Houston here. This will be the time. Like I've played, they've cost me like 10 grand in the last like 5 days, and then they scored 15 runs like immediately.
And maybe this. I hope today's the spot. Only 1% projected ownership. I'm going to be overweight to the field on Houston. Other side of the game, Framber Valdez is going to be on the mound for Houston. And Valdez here, I think that we really have to compare him to some of the other higher end arms on the slate, where it's Framber Valdez. Do we want more of him than guys like Tyler Mahle, Julio Urias, Joe Musgrove? I feel the least good about him amongst those pitchers, but 10% ownership, I'm willing to get to him. I just don't think that Framber Valdez is going to be a core piece of my lineups.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I'm at as well. Like, I think he's more expensive than I want to pay for, but I also think that he's not getting enough ownership compared to this group. We have him with about half the chance of being the top 2 pitcher as Tyler Mahle, but 1/5 the ownership. So clearly a profitable pivot there. You can do the same sort of thing where he's getting, like 80%, or he has like 80% chance of being a top 2 pitcher compared to Musgrove, but Musgrove's getting 3.5 times the ownership. Urias is getting less ownership than those guys. So that one's a lot closer, but it's just a situation where, again, I don't feel confident in any of these guys. So I'm perfectly fine just doing the opposite of whatever the field wants to do and putting myself in a position to where when things break my way, I'm in a good spot to get paid, because Framber Valdez is not a great strikeout pitcher. It's not a great matchup against the Padres, but he is absolutely elite at getting ground balls. He can work relatively deep into the game. He's only struck out 20.9% of right-handed hitters this year, but only a 290 expected WOBA, a sub 100 expected ISO, has just given up virtually no power. 3.9 implied run total for the Padres is fine. Like for comparison, the Padres right now have a 3.9 implied run total. The Tigers are at 3.8. It's not like there's some massive difference here in terms of, implied run totals between these teams. So even more so than usual, this is just a slate where it's just like, I don't really have a lot of positive things to say about anything. It's kind of just like, yeah, whatever is low owned, I'll play that, because this kind of just seems like a slate where it's just even more volatile than usual.
It's the pitchers for me. That's where I think I'm really going to be making the biggest difference. Like, I don't know, other than offenses, I'm going to be prioritizing the Chicago White Sox and Seattle Mariners, but I'm going to be mixing and matching a lot. I think that as we're talking through the slate, the spot that is really going to be what stands out about my lineups is going to be the Herman Marquez, Ian Anderson lineups being underweight to the Coors offenses. And that's probably what's going to differentiate me. As for the San Diego Padres as an offense, they're not picking up much ownership, but like you said, Framber Valdez, pretty high ground ball pitcher. We have the Padres with the second lowest top stack odds of the day, and they're low owned, but I think rightfully so.
Yeah. So you can sort of make the same case for the Padres, where it's just like, yeah, it's a really good offense. But the reason that I like an offense like Houston so much more than an offense like San Diego is just the ownership going to the opposing pitcher. Also, I think Musgrove is more likely to get lit up than Valdez, but that's not even really the reason. It's more so just that I think it's a low probability spot for both, given the pitching that they're going up against. But if the Astros put up a big line, you're just eliminating like 1/3 of the field right off the bat. Whereas if San Diego has a good game, you're eliminating like 10%, and you still kind of are in a situation where it's like, okay, I still need the Padres to really be the best stack today. Whereas Houston, for 1/3 of the field, if they go off against Musgrove, it's just like, okay, it doesn't matter what your offenses are, you don't have a chance of beating me. So the negative correlation with the field to me just makes Houston a much better stack than San Diego.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. It really has to do with people on Musgrove, not on Framber Valdez. And I do think now that we talk about the next pitcher here in the next game, Julio Urias on the mound for the Dodgers against the Giants, the matchup against the Giants is definitely not ideal. However, if I'm paying up for one pitcher today for tournaments, my highest priority one is going to be Julio Urias relative to ownership. So Tyler Mahle, obviously great spot against the Tigers. Joe Musgrove, high upside, but terrible spot for him against Houston. Julio Urias, I don't like the spot against the Giants, but he's picking up about 20% of the ownership that Mahle is right now, and I just don't think that's correct.
Yeah, agreed. He really stands out if you look at the top two pitchers tool. Second highest top two pitcher percentage on the slate, slightly ahead of Musgrove, about like 1.25-ish X from Valdez. Only getting about 20% ownership. That's like half of Musgrove. Like you said, it's like 40% of Tyler Mahle. I just think like, yeah, it's a tough matchup, but the park is really good. The Giants have a 3.8 implied run total. The Tigers are at 3.8. The Astros are at 3.7. There's no real difference to me in a lot of this. So the fact that Urias is a good pitcher, he has a 26.5% strikeout percentage this season. It is a good park to pitch in, and he's not getting much ownership. I'm more than happy to go there. He threw 86 pitches his last time out, went 6 innings. I don't really I don't love the matchup, but I don't love the matchup for almost any of the good pitchers today.
Yeah, and also on the other side with the Giants, we have them with the lowest top stack odds of any team on the slate. I don't really envision myself getting the Giants that often. Even with the low ownership, low stack odds, they look about appropriately on 1.5% chance to be a top stack compared to the 2.3% chance to be a top stack. Compared to the 1.5% ownership share, this is not going to be a spot where I really want to get to the Giants.
Agreed. If for example, let's say the Cincinnati game gets rained out and Urias goes from 19% to 50%, then I start to become interested in the Giants. But right now, just because I think Urias is going under owned, it's not going to push the Giants up for me. And then, obviously a really difficult park to hit in as well.
All right. And then do we have an official starting pitcher for the Giants? I had it listed as Sammy Long, but I don't know if that's...
DraftKings is guessing Sammy Long, but I don't think that's been confirmed.
All right. So we don't have Sammy Long in our data right now. That's going to make it a little bit hard to say. As of right now, we have the Dodgers as the second most rostered offense on DraftKings behind the Atlanta Braves, but still they have about half the amount of projected ownership. But who knows where that's actually going to stand when we actually get a confirmed starting pitcher. So any kind of takes here on the Dodgers or just wait to see who's pitching?
Yeah, I mean, wait to see who's pitching. If it is Sammy Long, he's put up pretty good strikeout numbers so far, and he has been throwing a lot of pitches. He's thrown 90 and 92 his last 2 times out. But in the limited time he's been in the majors, he has allowed a 203 expected ISO and a 351 expected WOBA to righties. And he's also only struck out 18.8% of righties compared to 29.7% of lefties. So I think looking at a lineup that has Trey Turner, Justin Turner, Mookie, Will Smith, Pollock, Taylor, and then the lefties here, in particular, Muncy just hit the hell out of left-handed pitching anyway. The Dodgers are going to look really good, even if it is Long, who I think does have some talent.
Yeah, and then once again, just wait to see who the starting pitcher is. It's the data we have here is going to be a little bit wonky without a known starting pitcher. So right now we have the Dodgers projected for a lot of ownership, but we'll see that stands later in the day. We've got other stuff like MLB Live Before Lock, so that will have a little bit more information. And then also so much DFS content on the channel today. We've got NASCAR, we've got MMA, we've got college football Live Before Lock coming up after this. So subscribe to the channel so you get access to all that DFS information. Also, today's show is sponsored by Jock Market. If you guys are new to Jock Market, head on over to the iTunes store, Google Play Store, all the different app stores. Download Jock Market. They don't have a website right now, but there is one coming soon. So download the app, and it is a fun different way to play DFS. It's instead of building lineups, there's no sort of salaries. Instead, you're bidding on players as if they are stocks, and there's an IPO period before. After that ends, though, it doesn't mean the slate starts. There's still decisions to be made. There is buying and selling players as the slate is going on. So if there's a player that's off to a bad start that you think is going to turn it around, you could buy low on them. You could sell high on somebody who's off to a hot start. So always a fun way to play DFS. We're going to be having more Jock Market shows coming soon. I think as soon as next week, actually. I don't want to spoil anything, but some of those shows, if you guys like the shows that Josh and I did together, we talked about Jock Market. We've got more of those coming in the future. And if you guys want to get in on the action, download the Jock Market app, use the promo code Awesemo to make your first deposit and get up to a $50 bonus on that first deposit. All right, one more game left.
Quick PSA, because I just realized that MMA starts at 2 p.m. Eastern today. So if you're planning on playing MMA and you haven't registered, I would hurry up and get in stuff.
I know what Adam was doing while I was doing the ad read.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the reason for that is it was supposed to be a card that was in London. So they booked a bunch of UK fighters. And then because of COVID, they weren't able to do the card there. So they just kept it as is, but left it in, kept a lot of the same fighters as is, but we're hosting the US. But they didn't want to change the time slot because Darren Till headlining. So they wanted to make it still prime time there. But yes, MMA, and that's also why MMA Live Before Lock also going to be early today. One of the reasons that we started the show super early on the YouTube channel, much earlier than usual. Final game we have here to talk about, Jose Suarez on the mound for the Angels against Texas. Kobe Allard going to be on the mound for the Rangers. Now, just starting by talking about Suarez, he has a good matchup. He's cheap. He's okay. He kind of makes it in my lineup just by default for those reasons.
Yeah, I kind of think he's just like the most talented pitcher in that price range. And then, oh, by the way, he's also facing the Rangers, which like this slate's so weird because it's just like a bunch of offenses that I don't want to take pitchers against and a bunch of pitchers I don't want to roster. And then now you just get like a reasonably priced Suarez at 6,500 against in one of the most favorable spots. He threw 73 pitches last time out, 77 the one before that, 82, 88, 88. Like how deep he goes into the game is the number one concern here. He hasn't gone 6 innings. You've seen 5 2/3 a couple of times, 5 1/3. There's certainly a chance that he goes, ends up getting pulled at like 4 innings or something like that. But given the issues with other pitchers, I think that Suarez stands out. The one concern that I would have, or the one thing I would point out, is he's pulling 21% ownership. I think that, again, like that makes sense given the matchup, given that he has been pretty good this year. He, as a starter, has only struck out 18.8% of hitters, 4.72 xFIP. But I think maybe you see that come up a little bit as things go forward. But it's still there's still a lot of uncertainty, like with how deep he's going to go into the game, and then also just how is he going to pitch. So I still think he's getting a little bit more ownership than he should relative to some of these other cheap pitchers.
Is that something that makes you like the Texas Rangers at all? It is a team that's already picking up a little bit of ownership. And Jose Suarez in his recent outings, 3 2/3 innings, 4 innings. I still think he's just going to make it in my lineups because he's cheap, and I hate all the other cheap pitching options on the slate. But Texas Rangers on the other side, I don't really know that I'm dying to roster them either.
Yeah, same here. I mean, it's always, you're never dying to roster the Rangers. I think that they make some sense just given the ownership that Suarez is getting, and they are cheap. I mean, you have a $3,600 Adolis Garcia, potentially DJ Peters batting cleanup at 2,400. Nate Lowe, lefty, but he's just actually a good hitter. Nick Solak's really cheap. Tavares leading off at 2,100 potentially. So it's a team you can get to. You could, and then go Tyler Mahle plus Urias or Musgrove, whatever, pay up for pitching. So I think Texas looks pretty good. They're not going to be my top stack or anything, but they do negatively correlate with the field a bit. They are projected to go a little bit under owned, and they are in the middle of the pack in top stack percentage as well.
Yeah, so Texas Rangers, I would feel differently if Suarez was popular and the Rangers were picking up no ownership, but the ownership's kind of already there for them, so not really a priority for me. But on the other side, Kobe Allard is going to be pitching for Texas, and Kobe Allard, typically a pitcher that I like to get some exposure against. And the issue I have today with the Angels is they are so much more popular than is really warranted. We have them with a 9.2% projected ownership share compared to only a 5.8% chance to be a top stack. Clearly a good spot against Kobe Allard. But the Angels are so overowned to the point where I just don't really think I'm going to be making stacks of them.
Yeah, they are getting a lot of ownership, like you said. I would like to stack against Allard, who's projected for 15% ownership because he is so cheap. I think it's an okay spot for the Angels. They're pretty cheap. You have a lot of power in the lineup, even though they swing and miss a lot. There are guys that can do a lot of damage. But like you said, you're just getting, I think, too much ownership right now going to the Angels. More likely to use them sort of as filler with my lower owned stacks. Like if I'm stacking Houston, I'm more than happy to go to, a $2,600 Joe Adele or, find a way to fit Ohtani in, which might be tough, in that specific example because Houston's expensive. But point being, the Angels, I think, are in a good spot. I think it's one of the better spots on the slate. I like their hitters. It's just you want to be very aware of the ownership elsewhere in your lineup.
All right. So that covers all the games. Any closing thoughts you have for today's slate, Adam?
I expect it to be, I think there's a lot of volatility. I don't think that there's a whole lot to be confident in, which to me in tournaments is really fun. It just makes it a little bit easier to trust the data and, kind of just play contrarian because there's not a whole lot of stuff that I'm going to get like FOMO about not playing.
Yeah, let's go for let's get a nice 3-2 Coors Field game today. That would be very nice for me. Also, thank you to Jock Market for sponsoring the show, guys. That is going to do it for us. But don't go anywhere. We've got a whole bunch of shows coming up today: college football, MMA, more MLB. Also, we've got the NASCAR Strategy Show. So stick around for all of that today. Good luck, guys.